Wishes well doing and welcome back to After They Found Atlantis. Today I want to talk about perhaps the most important contribution I feel I could make to the study of lost history. In particular, the lost history of Atlantis. So what is this contribution? Plato did not write any of the dialogues attributed to him. Instead, he was just a keeper of the discourses of Socrates. This idea, if true, could change our understanding of the lost history of Atlantis, and indeed change the entire understanding of our distant past, along with, most importantly, our futures. So I want to start here. How can I propose such a radical idea? Who in the history of the modern world ever said that Plato never would have written a dialogue? Well, believe it or not, Plato said it himself in two of his letters. The letters or epistles that we call number 2 and number 7. But let's come back to this later. First, I want to explain how I have come to this conclusion. It's the two dialogues concerning Atlantis, the Timaeus and the Critias. There are so many amazing things that the dialogues tell us, incredible things that turned out to be true, and leave us asking the question, how could have Plato ever have known this? These things I have gone over in previous videos, such as describing the geography of the Mediterranean perfectly, and unbelievably the opposite continent from Europe and Africa, which would be the today's Americas. Also, the dialogues describe the geography of Greece over 10,000 years ago, and how today it's just a skeleton of the land that once was. We now know that indeed the Cycladic Islands were once all connected, and the lands were much more bountiful in the past. My favorite subject, though, is the ancient city of Sais, and its foundress, the goddess Neith. The city of Sais is where the records of Atlantis were accounted to be, and is 10,000 years old. Turns out mainstream archaeology has found the city is ancient, at least 6,500 years old, and the mainstream also understands that the worship of Neith at Sais goes back to the first dynasty, 3100 BC. And as a matter of fact, the first queen of Egypt was Queen Neith-Hotep, which means Neith is satisfied. So Neith-Hotep ruled from Sais at the very beginning of all dynastic Egyptian history, where the people there worship the goddess Neith, which bears her name. These are just a few examples of the dialogues aligning with truth. And there are more instances, such as this, which many other alternative researchers have pointed out, that the dialogues account that Atlantis was sunk into the sea 11,600 years ago. And this coincides almost exactly with the Younger Dryas melt pulse-water B catastrophe, a period in our past with great floods and tremendous upheaval. Also in this, the dialogues account that our history is a cycle of destructions, where humankind is practically brought to extinction and loses the ability to write words, and loses almost all knowledge of the previous past. The dialogues say that it is then when humans must start all over again like children who know nothing. All these things, amongst others, led me to believe that these dialogues were speaking of real history and not something somebody made up. And that somebody is Plato. Let's talk about Plato. Plato was born a wealthy man in Athens during the classical period. His siblings were Glaucon, Adeimantus, and his half-brother Antiphon. He also had a sister named Prt1. His mother was Prt1, who was a descendant of Dropides and Solon. More on them later. His father was Ariston, who died when he was young, and Prt1 married the politician Prt. Plato is also related to Charmides and Critias, who were involved with the rule of the 30 tyrants. More on Critias later. Not much is known about Plato in his youth, but he became a student of Socrates, the great philosopher in Athens, in his early 20s. Plato, at about 40, began to write his 36 dialogues, mostly featuring Socrates, after Socrates' execution by the state of Athens in 399 BC. Plato was profoundly moved by his master's death. At this point, Plato was said to have traveled abroad, around the Mediterranean, from Greece to Italy to Egypt, until finally returning to Athens, whereupon he founded the Academy in the 380s BC. Plato later became involved in an affair in Sicily, where he attempted to assist a friend and disciple, Dion, to help enlighten Dion's relative, the tyrant Dionysius II, into a philosopher king. The attempt failed, and Dion was murdered at the end of the ordeal. Plato died when he was in his 80s. His writings became incredibly influential, and this is why it is said that everything in European philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. But in all this, there is a problem. It is what scholars call the Socratic problem. The Socratic problem is scholars don't know if Plato is speaking for Socrates or is Plato expressing his own philosophical views, using Socrates as a mouthpiece. Scholars argue over almost everything about the dialogues, such as what order they were written, and if a dialogue was even written by Plato at all, and not a later copycat. We must remember that the reason scholars argue over these points, and many more, is that these dialogues were lost for hundreds of years, and were only rediscovered just before the Renaissance period. In fact, it was because of the rediscovery of these dialogues, and also other Greek works such as those by Aristotle, who it is said was a student of Plato, that pulled Western culture out of the Dark Age. Are you still with me? So what I'm trying to argue now is Plato didn't create these dialogues. He was just a keeper of them. So if the dialogues aren't just made up, and they are actual historical conversations featuring Socrates, what does that mean about Atlantis? It means Atlantis was real history, and it's because of Socrates that we even know of it at all. Because Plato idolized Socrates. All of Socrates' followers did. Let's look at Socrates. The historical Socrates, in short, was a superhero. He was the wisest man in all of Athens. This according to the oracle at Delphi. To attest to this, someone once asked him, "How do you put up with your wife and her fiery temper, and always argumentative?" Socrates said, "That is precisely why I chose her. If I can put up with those things from her, then I can easily converse with anyone in Athens." Socrates was not only the wisest, but he was physically gifted. He had incredible stamina as a soldier. He once stood on the battlefield in one spot, and the enemy noticed him there from their position. The night passed, and in the morning, Socrates was standing in the same exact spot, and he hadn't moved at all. If the enemy only knew that Socrates was in a trance, consorting with his demon, a spirit guide, who often came to Socrates with guidance, they might have been even more apprehensive to fight him. Socrates also was always barefooted, even in the coldest of conditions, and alcohol had little effect on him. But his greatest gift was his wisdom, because he believed he was not wise, and this is what truly made him wise. Socrates spent his entire life in pursuit of knowledge. He couldn't believe he was the wisest man in Athens, so he spent his years searching for others who were the wisest, to question them. Maybe they were actually wiser than he. He would ask them questions, and in the end, no one he found was actually wiser. But he made many of the smartest and powerful men realize they did not know what they thought they did.
An example of this is when Socrates questions the Athenian general Laches about what he thinks courage is in the dialogue, the Laches. This is a play that is based on that dialogue.
So let me put this question to you, Laches. What is courage?
That is easy to answer, Socrates. It's remaining at your post, fighting with the enemy, and not running away.
And tell me, Laches, what about those men who fought while they were fleeing and did not remain at their posts?
Yes, these men were courageous also.
And was their courage shown on the field at Delium, when all of those men left their posts and joined the retreat?
Yes, there certainly was great courage shown then. And you were one of the most courageous.
And remember the Spartans at Plataea. They fled from the Persians at first, then turned and routed them and won the battle.
They did, yes.
So all of these things are courageous.
Yes.
But they didn't remain at their posts, did they?
No, they didn't.
But didn't you say that courage was remaining at your post and fighting?
Yes, I did, but that isn't the full picture.
But you could say Socrates was a rock star, and he had super fans. On the day of Socrates' execution, which was to be him drinking hemlock, one of his disciples was said to be particularly upset. He was Apollodorus. All the years in his later life, Apollodorus accounted Socrates, and so did others, like Plato's brother Glaucon. Here in the dialogue, The Symposium, we see how Glaucon wanted to find out about the time when Socrates went to a dinner at Agathon's, the famous Greek poet.
Apollodorus, I've been looking for you, he said. You know there once was a gathering at Agathon's when Socrates, Alcibiades, and their friends had dinner together. I wanted to ask you about the speeches they made on love. What were they? I heard a version from a man who had it from Phoenix, Philip's son, but it was badly garbled, and he said you were the one to ask. So please, will you tell me all about it? After all, Socrates is your friend. Who has a better right than you to report this conversation? But before you begin, he added, tell me this. Were you there yourself? Your friend must have really garbled his story, I replied, if you think this affair was so recent that I could have been there. I did think that, he said. Glaucon, how could you? You know very well Agathon hasn't lived in Athens for many years, while it's been less than 3 that I've been Socrates' companion and made it my job to know exactly what he says and does each day. Before that, I simply drifted aimlessly.
It turns out the account of that night was remembered by another superfan. His name was Aristodemus. Aristodemus was actually there with Socrates because he too, at the time, followed Socrates everywhere he went.
So it really was a long time ago, he said. Then who told you about it? Was it Socrates himself? Oh, for God's sake, of course not, I replied. It was the very same man who told Phoenix, a fellow called Aristodemus, from Cydathenium, a real runt of a man who always went barefoot. He went to the party because, I think, he was obsessed with Socrates, one of the worst cases at that time. Naturally, I checked part of his story with Socrates, and Socrates agreed with his account. Please tell me then, he said. You speak and I'll listen as we walk to the city. This is the perfect opportunity.
If Plato didn't create these writings out of the wild blue yonder, rather they were actual historical conversations, then it appears that these groups of philosophers and admirers of the superhero rock star Socrates were interested in hearing and collecting these conversations like they were rock albums of their favorite star. In the Parmenides, Cephalus is searching down this conversation that a young Socrates had with the aged philosopher Parmenides. This conversation was remembered and recited by Antiphon, Plato's half-brother, who had learned it by heart when he was young and practiced it till perfection. And let's remember that Glaucon, Adeimantus, and Antiphon are all Plato's brothers.
Parmenides, Cephalus. When we arrived in Athens from home in Clazomenae, we ran into Adeimantus and Glaucon in the marketplace. Adeimantus took me by the hand and said, "Welcome, Cephalus. If there is anything you want here that we can do for you, please tell us." "In fact, that's the very reason I'm here," I replied, "to ask a favor of you." "Tell us what you want," he said. And I replied, "Your half-brother on your mother's side, what was his name? I've forgotten. He would have been a child when I came here from Clazomenae to stay before, and that's a long time ago now. I think his father's name was Pyrilampes." "It was indeed," he said. "And his?" "Antiphon. But why do you ask?" "These men are fellow citizens of mine," I said, "keen philosophers, and they have heard that this Antiphon met many times with a friend of Zeno's called Pythagoras, and can recite from memory the discussion that Socrates and Zeno and Parmenides once had, since he heard it often from Pythagoras." "That's true," he said. "Well, we want to hear that discussion," I replied. "Nothing hard about that," he said. "When Antiphon was a young man, he practiced it to perfection. Although these days, just like the grandfather he's named for, he devotes most of his time to horses. But if that's what's called for, let's go to his house. He left here to go home just a short time ago, but he lives close by in Melite."
I want to thank you for watching this far. We are on the pursuit of our prey, which is trying to present how it might be that Plato was not a creator, but rather a preserver of the dialogues attributed to him. Let's now examine Plato's letters. There are 13 letters. Of course, scholars again can't agree that they are all Plato and not a later copycat. But let's look at letter number 2. It starts off, "Wishes well-doing." Who says that? Addressed to Dionysus, which before mentioned was the tyrant of Syracuse, who actually effectively kept Plato prisoner on more than one occasion. But here in letter 2, we get this. Plato says he would not write a treatise or any writing because reading and writing is not the best way. The best way is learning by heart and remembering. Beware, however, lest these doctrines be ever divulged to uneducated people, for there are hardly any doctrines, I believe, which sound more absurd than these to the vulgar, or, on the other hand, more admirable and inspired to men of fine disposition. For it is through being repeated and listened to frequently for many years that these doctrines are refined at length like gold, with prolonged labor. But listen now to the most remarkable result of all. Quite a number of men there are who have listened to these doctrines, men capable of learning and capable also of holding them in mind and judging them by all sorts of tests, and who have been hearers of mine for no less than 30 years and are now quite old. And these men now declare that the doctrines that they once held to be most incredible appear to them now the most credible, and what they then held most credible now appears the opposite. So bearing this in mind, have a care, lest one day you should repent of what has now been divulged improperly. The greatest safeguard is to avoid writing and to learn by heart, for it is not possible that what is written down should not get divulged. For this reason, I myself have never yet written anything on these subjects, and no treatise by Plato exists or will exist. But those which now bear his name belong to a Socrates, become fair and young. Fare thee well, and give me credence. And now, to begin with, read this letter over repeatedly, and then burn it up. So down here in the notes we get this. This curious statement seems based on epistle number 7. So scholars find it curious that Plato would say he would never write anything, and that all that has his name belongs to Socrates. They find this curious. And what about that letter 7 by Plato? In it, he says, anyone that seriously studies high matters will be the last to write about them.
For this reason, anyone who is seriously studying high matters will be the last to write about them and thus expose his thought to the envy and criticism of men. What I have said comes in short to this. Whenever we see a book, whether the laws of a legislator or a composition on any other subject, we can be sure that if the author is really serious, this book does not contain his best thoughts. They are stored away with the fairest of his possessions, and if he has committed these serious thoughts to writing, it is because men, not the gods, have taken his wits away.
So Plato says you should never put your best thoughts down in writing. Could you imagine the man who all of Western philosophy owes footnotes to, didn't even put down his best thoughts in writing? Think about that for a second. So what's going on there? Perhaps it's not Plato we owe everything to, but rather it is Socrates. Let's now look at the other sources of Socrates in history. One is the comedic playwright Aristophanes, who wrote a comedic play about Socrates poking fun at him, called The Clouds.
Oh, Socrates!
What do you want, mortal?
What are you doing up there?
I walk upon the air and elevate my mind. Only up here, dangling my vast intellect in the heavens, can I scientifically perceive the secrets of the universe.
By Zeus, what marvelous words!
Zeus? Did I hear you say Zeus? Are you mad, sir? There is no Zeus.
No Zeus? Then who makes it rain?
Have you ever seen it rain out of an empty sky?
No.
But when there are clouds, it rains?
Yes.
Therefore, sir, it is the clouds that cause rain, not Zeus.
Powerfully argued. But what about thunder? Surely the gods cause thunder.
Reflect, sir. When you gorge yourself on your wife's stew, does not your belly rumble?
True.
Think of the rumble your tiny stomach makes. Then think of the sound the boundless clouds can produce when they have indigestion.
Oh, sacred and wondrous thoughts! Teach me to reason like you, O Socrates, and success will be mine!
The other source for the historical Socrates is Xenophon. Xenophon was another disciple of Socrates, who was an incredible soldier and leader and historian and author, who also extensively accounted Socrates' conversations. Xenophon wrote the 10,000, which describes his amazing journey back from Persia when his army was stranded there for years and had to fight their way back to Greece. By the time Xenophon got back home, he discovered Socrates had been executed by the state of Athens. Most scholars tend to think that Xenophon's Socrates is different from Plato's. But here, Professor Sandra Peterson explains how she feels that the two Socrates are the same.
So now, Professor Sandra Peterson on Xenophon's Socrates on the Just and Lawful in Memorabilia 4:4.
I arrived at reading Xenophon's Socratic writings rather late in life. As I recall, it was because undergraduate classics majors that were taking a Plato course of mine in the philosophy department grumbled that Plato was not the only author that wrote about Socrates. Now I am very grateful for their grumbles. When I began to read Xenophon's depiction of his Socrates, I was immediately drawn in. I had the impression that I was reading about the same Socrates I had read about in Plato, although Xenophon presented different Socratic conversations. When I later paid attention to scholarship about Xenophon, I learned that many careful readers did not believe that Xenophon's Socrates and Plato's Socrates were the same character. I learned that there was a list of arguable differences that I had not noticed. At the present time, I realize that I must acknowledge more differences of presentation than I had noticed in my earliest reading. However, I must also acknowledge that my earliest uninformed impression has settled into a strong and lasting impression. I simply cannot shake it off. Even today, Xenophon's Socrates seems to me very much the same as Plato's.
Professor Sandra Peterson feels that they are the same, which is the conclusion that I have come to. It appears Xenophon was another superfan and was documenting the same historical Socrates and his discourses like the others.
Again, I'm so glad you have watched this far. I have 2 more pieces of evidence in this case, and I think they are both bombshells. So come on, let's continue further. We are almost there. Now, scholars say that it was Socrates who never wrote anything down. So that's why Plato and others made him a character and put him talking to many historical figures in their largely fictional settings. Plato himself never speaks in any of the dialogues, but he does get mentioned in the trial of Socrates, where he can pay some money in Socrates' name. The second time he gets mentioned is our first bombshell. It's the time Plato is mentioned in the Phaedo. Now, Phaedo was another philosopher who actually started his own school later on. But in the dialogue, the Phaedo, we have the occasion of Socrates' death and last day on earth. And in the dialogue, Phaedo tells Ecrates that Plato wasn't even there because he was ill.
Were you with Socrates yourself, Phaedo, on the day when he drank the poison in prison, or did someone else tell you about it? I was there myself, Ecrates. What are the things he said before he died, and how did he die? I should be glad to hear this. Hardly anyone from Phlius visits Athens nowadays, nor has any stranger come from Athens for some time who could give us a clear account of what happened, except that he drank the poison and died, but nothing more. I certainly found being there an astonishing experience. Although I was witnessing the death of one who was my friend, I had no feeling of pity, for the man appeared happy in both manner and words as he died nobly and without fear, Ecrates, so that it struck me that even in going down to the underworld he was going with the gods' blessing, and that he would fare well when he got there, if anyone ever does. That is why I had no feeling of pity, such as would seem natural in my sorrow, nor indeed of pleasure, as we engaged in philosophical discussions as we were accustomed to do, for our arguments were of that sort. But I had a strange feeling, an unaccustomed mixture of pleasure and pain at the same time, as I reflected that he was just about to die. All of us present were affected in much the same way, sometimes laughing, then weeping, especially one of us, Apollodorus. You know the man and his ways. Of course I do. He was quite overcome, but I was myself disturbed, and so were the others. Who, Phaedo, were those present? Among the local people there was Apollodorus, whom I mentioned, Critobulus and his father, also Hermogenes, Epigenes, Aeschines, and Antisthenes. Ctesippus of Panea was there, Menexenus, and some others. Plato, I believe, was ill.
On Socrates' last day. So we are to believe that Plato is telling us of the happenings of that day, but for some reason he wrote himself out of the scene. Why? I believe it's because Plato again didn't create these dialogues. And on that actual historic day, Socrates' last day on earth, Plato was not there because he really was ill, and somebody else accounted the history of that day. Are you ready for the second bombshell? Good. We could stay here in the Phaedo. Now, Plato was not there, but another philosopher was.
He is of the foreigners that are listed here.
Were there some foreigners present? Yes, Simmias from Thebes, and Keves and Phedondes from Megara, Euclides and Terpsion.
He was Euclides, or Euclid. Now, Euclides also started his own school in Megara, and he too accounted Socrates' conversations in his own dialogues, as they might say. But they all have been lost to history. But Euclid appears in another dialogue. It is called the Theaetetus. And in the Theaetetus, we get to see how a dialogue is recorded.
Theaetetus. Are you only just in from the country, Terpsion, or have you been here some time? I've been here a good while. In fact, I have been looking for you in the marketplace and wondering that I couldn't find you. Well, you couldn't because I was not in the city. Where have you been then? I went down to the harbour, and as I was going I met Theaetetus being taken to Athens from the camp at Corinth. Alive or dead? Alive, but that's about all one could say. Badly wounded for one thing, but the real trouble is this sickness that has broken out in the army. Dysentery? Yes. What a man to lose. Yes, a fine man, Terpsion. Only just now I was listening to some people singing his praises for the way he behaved in battle. Well, there's nothing extraordinary about that. Much more to be wondered about if he hadn't distinguished himself. But why didn't he put up here at Megara? He was in a hurry to get home. I kept asking him myself and advising him, but he wouldn't. So I saw him on his way. And as I was coming back, I thought of Socrates and what a remarkably good prophet he was, as usual, about Theaetetus. It was not long before his death, if I remember rightly, that he came across Theaetetus, who was a boy at the time. Socrates met him and had a talk with him, and was very much struck with his natural ability. And when I went to Athens, he repeated to me the discussion they had had, which was well worth listening to. And he said to me then that we should inevitably hear more of Theaetetus if he lived to grow up. Well, he appears to have been right enough. But what was the discussion? Could you tell it to me? Good Lord, no. Not from memory, anyway. But I made some notes of it at the time, as soon as I got home. Then afterwards I recalled it at my leisure and wrote it out, and whenever I went to Athens I used to ask Socrates about the points I couldn't remember, and correct my version when I got home. The result is that I have got pretty well the whole discussion in writing. Yes, of course. I have heard you say that before, and I have always been meaning to ask you to show it to me, though I have been so long about it. But is there any reason why we shouldn't go through it now? I want a rest in any case after my journey in from the country. Well, I shouldn't mind sitting down either. I saw Theaetetus as far as Erineum. Come along, we will get the slave to read it to us while we rest. Right. This is the book, Terpsion, you see. I have written it out like this. I have not made Socrates relate the conversation as he related it to me, but I represent him as speaking directly to the person with whom he said he had this conversation. These were, he told me, Theodorus, the geometer, and Theaetetus. I wanted in the written version to avoid the bother of having the bits of narrative in between the speeches. I mean when Socrates, whenever he mentions his own part in the discussion, says, and I maintained, or I said, or the person answering, he agreed, or he would not admit this. That is why I have made him talk directly to them and have left out these formulae. Well, that's quite in order, Euclides. Now, boy, let us have it.
So this is how I believe the dialogues were really written. By different philosophers and superfans, accounting Socrates and his real conversations in book form or oral form. And get this, Socrates was voted to die in court, mainly because the public blamed him for the actions of his former students, and they were Alcibiades and Critias. Alcibiades, who was related to Pericles, the former great leader of Athens, left the city because of his political rivals, and gave Sparta important information that helped Sparta win the war against Athens. And later, Critias, who was related to Solon, the legendary lawmaker of Athens, was basically put in charge of the city by Sparta when he became the leader of the 30 tyrants, who executed about 5% of the population while holding power, before they were overthrown and Critias was killed, and democracy was restored. And some of those who restored the democracy later brought charges against Socrates, and he was killed. All this was happening during a plague, because those in Athens walled themselves in the city during the conflict. So yeah, Socrates was not popular, nor anyone who was a disciple of him at the time. So what did the disciples do? They left Athens, and where did they go? They went to Megara, and were received by Euclides. This is where Plato went, and probably with the dialogues that he had. And there, I'm sure, is where he shared them with those of Euclides. And finally, Plato brought the entire library back to Athens after things had settled down. It's then when Plato started his academy. And somehow along the way, through dark ages and time, I think Plato was mistakenly given credit for creating the entire library of Socrates' dialogues. But they weren't a creation. They were real history. And so was Atlantis. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.